Good morning, all, and you're very welcome to this session of the Intertrade Ireland All-Ireland Innovation Speaker Series, which is focusing in on the entrepreneurial ecosystem and the role that the university plays in it. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by a good friend and colleague of mine, Professor James Cunningham of Newcastle University. James has been based in UCD, in UI Galway, and Northumbria University before taking up the Professor of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Newcastle University Business School. His research is focused on the issue of strategy and concerning scientists as principal investigators and investigating the issue of university technology commercialization and public sector and technology entrepreneurship and the entrepreneurial university. James, thank you very much. And today's talk looking at academic entrepreneurship and the principal investigator role and impact challenge is something that's very relevant to the Irish audience. So I'll hand over to you now and I will take some questions at the end. Thanks very much, James.
Great. Thanks very much, Lawrence, for the kind invitation. And it's great. I see that there are some familiar faces and people here. So it's really great to have this invitation and to participate, I think, in a very important event to discuss as part of this series, the important role of that universities play within our societies for society and also economic good. What I want to sort of focus on today is, I suppose, give you a sort of a whistle-stop tour of about over a decade of research that I've been looking at in terms of scientists when they get publicly funded money and become a principal investigator. So maybe initially just to stand back and look at maybe the broader drivers that are influencing both universities' role in supporting academic entrepreneurship, and how that then obviously has maybe a spillover effect into the region and the regional sort of context. Look at the sort of role and why do scientists want to become principal investigators. And then I will share with you different sort of insights that I've garnered over the years in terms of the role, and also some more recent research in terms of studies I've done with respect with the European Commission and also a large-scale study that we did in Ireland last year. And then I suppose just stand back and then reflect, well, what does this mean for universities, funding bodies, industry, and PIs? As Lauren said, I suppose just maybe put in context in terms of where my research fits. So this morning I'll be looking at in terms of the academic entrepreneur and entrepreneurship. So how does entrepreneurship happen within the university community? So very much interest at the micro level, the individual actor of the scientist or the researcher. I'm also interested more widely, working with colleagues, looking at the role of how do universities participate, engage in technology transfer, commercialization, and also their role in terms of society. And then more widely, looking at the bigger sort of policy issues and how do sort of government, researchers, industry, SMEs, the third sector, all sort of interact and engage in terms of creating these ecosystems for entrepreneurship, but also for innovation sort of purposes. So the focus this morning is very much at the sort of micro level. So standing back, I suppose we have all become very attuned to science, part of the broad public discourse around COVID. We see scientists more often in terms of different media outlets, and they have become very, very visible part of the whole sort of pandemic and COVID experience over the last 18 months to 2 years. But when you stand back, well, what is driving academic entrepreneurship and driving universities in terms of this agenda? Well, you see there's this sort of large sort of competition or civic competition between China, US, France, UK, all sort of countries in terms of scientific production. You even just look alone over the last 18 months in terms of the phenomenal amount of science that has been produced and published a result of COVID. And then that brings, I suppose, knock-on productivity expectations for individual sort of researchers. Never in terms of the history of humanity, in terms of we're seeing more rapid pace in terms of scientific discovery. Not that negates that it isn't challenging or difficult, but as we can see with the sort of COVID vaccines, scientific discovery can happen at a fairly rapid rate when the resources and the momentum is there. Also, I suppose governments are sitting back and thinking, okay, well, how do they spend whatever sort of public money is on funding science, research, commercialization, universities? So again, I suppose a lot of the focus now is orientated towards mission orientated. So looking at the grand challenges that are part of the Horizon Europe program. And if you look at the Irish government, you look at the UK government, taking this very much around in the environment or some issues around health and that. But also very much focused on getting multidisciplinary teams together, sort of social sciences, life scientists, working together on sort of common problems that have maybe a commercial end, but also have a societal value. Then I suppose there's this ongoing debate in relation to the balance between fundamental and applied research. Fundamental is the basic science, maybe the blue skies, cutting edge, maybe high risk, and the applied is maybe more near to market. Obviously, maybe more near to market, maybe is favoured more because obviously there may be some of the risks are already. Then I suppose in terms of as we come out of the sort of post-COVID period, the big question continues to be who funds public science. You're seeing a lot of more public funded programs require further industry engagements in terms of, not alone in terms of maybe soft commitments, but also in terms of putting some investment in terms of hard cash as part of funding proposals. So the question is then, in terms of if science is being funded in terms of primarily through maybe some of the public domain, then what are the societal benefits, but also then how is that research being commercialized and maybe being more widely available? Big debates ongoing in terms of the open nature of science. So in some senses, when an academic publishes a paper, it should be automatically open access. That's one argument. And then you have a lot of sort of publishers, obviously, for you to have open access require a fee to do that. So you're seeing maybe a lot more sort of public programs requiring maybe more open science in relation to access to knowledge. And then you're seeing in industry a lot more focus on and plans around open innovation and more collaboration. I think without a doubt, I suppose there's a broad recognition now that universities are strong engines of economic growth, are strong engines within their region, have direct and indirect spillover effects in terms of the regions that they inhabit, and also are very important in terms of the region, in terms of how it's perceived internationally and also within a national context. And still, university industry collaborations still remain very, very complex because you have, I suppose, still an ongoing mutual incomprehension between, on the one hand, science and researchers and academics, and on the other hand, industry. And there are very two distinct cultures operating. So therefore, it can become very, very difficult. So therefore, initiatives like Knowledge Transfer Ireland, having standardized agreements that make those relationships a bit easier to manage and reduce maybe some of the costs are very important. So why I became interested in scientists in the principal investigator role because of my experiences of being a principal investigator. So no one really tells you in terms of what is really involved. I suppose it's part of sort of the expectation as being an active researcher and scientist that you go and look for funding to support your research, or you're part of maybe collective efforts within whatever institution you're in to go and seek funding to pursue research, be it on a fundamental or an applied basis. So a simple sort of definition that I use is that PI is the person in charge whose direct responsibility for completion of a funded project. And they are responsible for leading the science and also reporting the funding agency. So, and I suppose it's commonly used term within science and within funding bodies, and I suppose a lot of industry practitioners would be fairly familiar with the term. But I suppose that's the more visible part in terms of they are the designated person. But what we have sort of found in the research I've been involved in over the last decade or so is that it involves a lot more invisible activities. So it is about being the research strategist, it's about being the team leader, it's about obviously managing a lot of the administration that goes with grants, but also as you're promoting the project, you're mentoring and supervising a team, and also you're collaborating maybe with a lot of industry partners, maybe public sector, non-governmental organizations. So in some senses, there's a lot to the role that is maybe not always visible or apparent on first glance. Well, why do scientists become a PI? Well, I suppose we found, there are two major pull and push factors. One is really that they want to have control over their scientific agenda. So they see that they have a very clear vision in terms of whatever their domain area is. And in order so securing funding and that is a means of controlling that agenda. It obviously has some benefits in terms of career and prestige, but also I suppose there is motivation around their drive and ambition. Also, I suppose there are push factors. So someone may have a particular expertise that is very sought after in a particular domain area, and they are then sort of automatically I suppose pushed into becoming a sort of PI. For some, depending on the nature of their contract in the institution that they might have no option but to see if they can secure a PI role in order to continue on in the institution. And also, I suppose there's an increasing expectation in academic institutions as one's career progresses, is that becoming a PI would be part of that role. So what I argue, and then I'll come around to it and come to this point at the end, is that scientists are very critical boundary spanning actors within a region. So those that are very active will be engaging with industry partners not only within the region, but also nationally and internationally. And same with the academic communities and any other stakeholders that are relevant in terms of their research domain. They're also market shapers in terms of, if you look at any of our technology has come from the public sector, publicly funded science space. So those, and I suppose the example of COVID is quickly, so not alone have those scientists, particularly if you look at Oxford, have not alone shaped science, but also in terms of shaped markets, in terms of what we've experienced in terms of vaccination programs. And there are less visible examples right across different domain areas. So regions having sort of scientists and PI role is absolutely critical for a region and also for universities, because they form the bedrock for the pursuance of academic entrepreneurship. So in the next few minutes, I'll just give you a sort of a whistle-stop tour of some sort of insights from the various pieces of work and that have been done over the years on PIs in the scientists in the PI role. So, what do we know? So, firstly, is that scientists in the PI role have a very clear vision of their scientific contribution. Interestingly, when interviewing and engaging with PIs as part of this ongoing research, it's very clear that they have that distinct vision. So that vision might be 20, 30 years out, it might be highly ambitious and all of that, but they have a very clear sense of what that is. Also, they're very proactive in terms of shaping those scientific avenues. So they're not waiting for things to happen. They're going out in terms of going back to the motivation, trying to sort of taking some degree of control. Surprisingly, they are very selective and focused in terms of the funding that they will pursue. So they will pursue funding that helps them to realize their vision, and will pursue funding instruments that suits in terms of where they are in terms of their research. Interestingly, which is good from a regional sort of impact and wider impact point of view, is that they're open to all forms of collaboration. So they'll collaborate with industry partners, with other researchers, they'll work with end users, all to realize that sort of vision that they have for their scientific agenda. And also, they're strategizing consistently. So they're always thinking about how can they realize their vision. And this is something that they do on a fairly regular basis. Real motivation, I think, that we have found consistently in terms of research that we've done, is really that they're motivated by problems and prioritization of new knowledge. Going back to Merton's very famous book in 1968 called Ethos of Science. So they are driven and motivated by problem solving and unearthing new knowledge. What we've also found is at a particular stage of their career, particularly very experienced PIs, is that they will either continue on existing scientific trajectories or they will open up new scientific trajectories. So they'll, in some senses, risk things again and open up new research avenues. As I said at the very outset, is that there's no real formal training or role preparation to become a PI. So they accumulate practices from what they experienced themselves or from others, and they very much learn on the job. And they learn through the experiences that they have gotten maybe at the early stages, what they've looked at colleagues, a lot alone in their local context, but also in terms of their wider community. And that is not alone in the academic context, but also in industry and other settings. And also, I suppose what we found is that there are gender and equality and diversity issues in terms of PIs. So a lot of underrepresentation of female PIs, a lot of underrepresentation of minorities in terms of publicly funded science programs. Well, what some maybe challenges to PI's experience? Well, I suppose in terms of there's three dimensions to that. There's ones that are at the project level, so you're the PI, you're managing project, and I suppose that there are always challenges around the administration and the reporting requirements back to the funders and how that is funded and supported from the project or from the host institution. The training and support to be a PI or to manage some of the challenges that go with that. And sometimes I suppose PIs can get very perplexed or can feel that the power of the industry partners can be very overbearing, or they may lose interest over time, or they can be very demanding at times in terms of trying to direct a scientific avenue in a certain particular direction. Within universities, I suppose, and within sort of public research organisations, I suppose the availability of technology transfer support, and also just availability of expertise around the broader academic entrepreneurship agenda around technology knowledge transfer. And then I suppose there are the more wider debates then in terms of when you look at outside of the academic institution, I suppose in terms of what to prioritise. I suppose it's the old sort of debate in terms of, is it producing science in terms of journal papers, or is it around the tension around commercialisation and technology transfer? How do you sort of manage some maybe the competing interests of stakeholders, and also in terms of whether, I suppose, funding agencies are really interested in the results and the science that is being achieved, or scientific results that have been achieved. So these are more wider ones. The PI role, as I said, when I looked at the sort of the early on, is really more than just being a leader in science. It's about managing and leading people, it's about resources, it's about collaborations, it's about relationship management, all of these sort of very different activities. So then when we sort of talk to scientists in terms of, well, what are the managerial challenges that they face? A lot of them you can quite naturally focus in terms of just managing the project. So again, making sure that they have the best team, recruiting the best postdocs, research assistants, maybe experienced researchers, and having them as part of the team. Just making sure the project works, looking at in terms of that the project is focused and aligned. And some of these projects can be large scale, multi-partner, multi-country, multi-setting in terms of context between industries and other science contexts. So they can be very, very complex. And also, as we move more towards multidisciplinary research projects, is just managing different disciplines. So how do you get sort of the common discourse around that people can understand what is the scientific objective, what is the broader impact objective in relation to that, and how you can, from each discipline, can contribute to that, and also share sort of the sort of progress that's being made. Really sort of very positive things about sort of public funded research and PIs is that the more culturally diverse, the more disciplinary diverse, that leads obviously to more better impact and outcomes. So obviously managing different cultures, different sort of experiences is critically important. And lastly is around performance management, just making sure that the project delivers based on what was the initial proposal outlined. The other concern that PIs have in terms of challenges is around just looking at, so if you were, let's say, in e-commerce a number of years ago, now cybersecurity, so making sure that there's the relevancy of what you're doing. So you're always maybe looking at scanning out in the external environment, the relevancy of what you do, so that you have some degree of maintaining project agility. And I suppose maybe that continues to be a concern for scientists, no matter what the discipline area that they come from. The other challenge I suppose scientists have to figure out is, well, how do they create value? So we as individual citizens society will say, okay, the government is investing money on our behalf into public science. So we need to be assured that we're getting some form of return as society from that. So we get that in the form of, obviously, in terms of maybe at the very end, long term, in terms of as end users, as customers, in terms of products and services, or in the life and health sciences. But also government is investing a lot in that through different funding bodies. So they want to make sure that they get a return. Industry, maybe is becoming to more increasingly co-investing in science and supporting publicly funded PIs. So there is. And then obviously academic institutions, when it comes to QS rankings, international rankings, national research evaluation systems, want to demonstrate in terms of their standing within their sort of arenas and for the different stakeholders that are important to them. So in some senses, a PI has to figure out, well, how do they create value for industry, government, end users, society, and academia? And for that, sort of we argue is that they have to have very strong civilian ties. So they have to have strong networks. So that's why having strong networks within a region and beyond is critically important. And they work in terms of between all of these boundaries and these actors to try and create value on that one funding proposal that they're putting forward to Science Foundation Ireland or the ESRC or whatever it is. So in some senses, it's the summation of some of that sort of boundary spanning and that. And in essence, there's going to be some sort of friction. There has to be some trade-offs. The PI has to make some trade-offs in relation to that. So how do they do it in practice? Well, I suppose there's two mechanisms that we found in terms of how they capture value. So they're the boundary spanning approach. So they work with sort of a government, industry, and society and figure it out in terms of how they actually capture value. The other one is becoming maybe more of a science broker. PI is a science broker, where they're sort of looking at the funding body, trying to anticipate, trying to capture some signals of what would pique their interest, looking at in terms of what are happening in society, as well as the industry and university, and in some senses brokering those in terms of trying to capture the value. So that is tricky. So it means broader in terms of moving out of your scientific domain, looking at your scientific domain and how that relates in terms of the broader sort of regional and national, international in terms of the dimension, both in terms of scientific, industry, funding bodies, all of that. So that is a quite complex and tricky task, and something that's successful PIs do it as built on their daily sort of practices as such. But also when they're doing that, it means when they're boundary spanning, that they experience some degree of role violation. So that their identities, in some senses, that their identities morph into that of a sort of research contractor, maybe a project manager, an entrepreneur, and a science networker. So if they're maybe more business focused or more sort of oriented that, so maybe more towards the project manager and entrepreneur, or in terms of research contract, let's say more science-based, it's research contractor and science networking base. So this is based on just a sort of work that Conor O'Kane has led in the University of Otago, where we look at the sort of health and life sciences PIs. But again, I suppose the message here is that there is some degree of fragmentation of their role identity once they become a PI, and once they are engaged in this boundary spanning activity, once they're involved in trying to create that value capture, create value for stakeholders as part of the role of a principal investigator. And this I suppose then means that the role of the institutions, where they are, how are they supported in the role, what is the institutional support for them is critically important. And particularly as part of maybe designated research centres like the Tyndall Institute in UCC or other ones in different universities, that becomes critically important. And the value that these researchers give, and maybe it's not always obvious or very visible to maybe university administrators, but they provide a critical support for PIs, what we found. So working on a study with Dr. Brendan Dolan and Professor Callum McGregor in Galway in the Cunningham Medical Device Research Centre funded by SFI. So we looked at that in the medical sort of device setting with PIs. And what we found is that being part of a research centre really helps in terms of research quality enhancement. So you're with a group of colleagues from different discipline areas, and being part of that environment really pushes in terms of individual PIs. Also, these centres are very helpful in terms of brokering these relationships and collaborations, particularly with industry partners, not alone in the sort of regional context, but nationally and internationally. So in some senses, within these research centres, that they can be some form of expertise that helps the PI do some of that activity. Also, really tangible support for PIs to figure out, well, what is the research impact agenda? There's a whole industry now is developed around, how scientists try and create impacts and all that. So really try and help PIs to figure out, well, what impact, how do they go about it? How do they need to capture it? How do they plan in terms of impact as part of their scientific agenda? And also, I suppose, being part of a research centre, scientists in the PI role spoke about in terms of that helps them, maybe gives them some degree of advantage when they're trying to get some sort of additional sort of resources within their institution, or also from other sources. So where does that leave us? Maybe about 2 years ago, myself and Paul O'Reilly at TU Dublin were commissioned by the European Commission as part of their flagship Innovation Radar programme to look at especially the role of what they call as project coordinators, or what we would term as PIs. And sort of, so they have been looking at, in terms of that sort of programme, looking at the configuration of teams, looking at the commercial impact, all of that. But one of the things that they were really interested in terms of the role of the individuals, the PI, the project coordinator, in terms of driving sort of science, and particularly the commercialisation, the academic entrepreneurship agenda. So part of that, we did two things. One, we did a sort of a major study in terms of looking at the literature, the existing sort of evidence, what's out there based on our own work and more broadly. And then also in terms of, we did a follow-on survey, which I'll give you the key highlights of that in a minute. So we identified sort of the key roles of being a research leader, being a resource allocator, being an innovator enabler, project coordinator, and being a boundary spanner, which I talked about before. And I suppose we posited, a broader sort of maybe understanding of where how PIs aren't in terms of what makes a PI. So there are sort of the antecedent individual factors in terms of their networks, their knowledge and know-how, their career trajectory, and also in terms of the context where they sit, in terms of whether institutions support this, where their incentives, what is the sort of policy context within the national sort of setting that they are. This is considering when you're looking at an EU sort of program.
Pieces of work, but again, this doesn't cover implementation. So
sorry, James, I think to try and mute.
No problem at all.
Not sure where they could.
Would somebody turn off their thing, whichever it is?
It's one of our companies that we're trying to do.
Okay, sorry about that, James.
No problem at all. That's fine. That's fine. No problem. Okay, no problem. I'll continue on. Yeah, and also looking at in terms of no problem at all. Thanks for first. And no problem looking at in terms of the project factors as well. There, in terms of the competencies that of the team that you bring together, and also diversity of the discipline and the institutional in terms of the regional, national, international actors you bring. I talked about the threshold role, but also there are some more expanded PI role capacities. So you have to be effective research strategists, an economic agent. You look at in terms of that value creation, also manager governor, that then leads to some of these outcomes and impacts that we talked about. So there's the technology transfer impacts, there obviously the scientific ones, which are a given. There's also the impact in terms of developing scientists and researchers that not alone continue on maybe in a university or public research organisation, but also move out into industry, government, and also in terms of the third sector. There's also more wider social and societal impacts, and also there are the more broader political non-market issues as well. So as part of that work, Paul and I, with Dara Hoopers at TU Dublin, did a large-scale purpose study of some PIs, so the first of its kind within a sort of European Commission sort of context. And what we sort of maybe highlight, there's a lot of there, it's available publicly, so and I'm very happy to share any of the links after this talk, so please get in touch if you want any more information. So really, what were the top three motivations of PIs? Well, going back to Merton's idea, problem solving, utilization of new knowledge, the scientific opportunity, but also the potential impact on society. So again, that is a very strong motivation for PIs. The challenges they are, I suppose there's no surprise in some ways, but again, it's good to get further affirmation of that, is around managing the technology transfer and commercialization aspects of that. That, I suppose, continues to be a challenge for PIs. And I suppose this is maybe specific to the Innovation Radar one project that we were looking at. But again, the ability to collaborate was a very important influence in terms of delivering successful innovation outcomes. So the ability of the PIs to collaborate effectively with a lot of different stakeholders to realise and mobilise innovation outcomes was critically important. Turning to an Irish context, which I mentioned at the very start, working again with sort of Dr. Brendan Dolan and Professor Caroline McGregor as part of one of the funded streams within CURM, the SFI Researcher for Medical Devices research. So we have a principal investigator impact strand there. So if you look at www.piimpact.com, this is my plug. We have a lot of resources there in terms of for PIs, in terms of practical toolkits for them to figure out the whole impact agenda and all of that. But as part of that work, we did a large-scale study of publicly funded PIs in Ireland from 2015 to 2020. Last year, around different funding programs across a broad range of funding instruments, and across different domain areas. So we had about a 45% response rate, and we had to go to different funding bodies to identify different PIs. As you can see there, we got a good representation from life sciences, physical sciences, and humanities and social sciences, and a good breakdown between male and female PIs. 60% of those that responded had no experience of commercialization. 9% had formed their academic companies, and 8% had been involved in licensing a particular technology. So, what were their perspectives on impact? What did they feel in terms of their top their research have contributed to? First, I suppose the collectively was in terms of just knowledge formation, training, and capacity building. So again, that's part of this sort of building, I suppose, the national research system in an Irish context. Understanding of the ideas and the reality and value beliefs. So that's making things happen, but also in terms of influencing sort of policy. The least rated one in terms of the type of impact was just the management of the environment. Then when it came to sort of technology transfer activities, what you found, obviously, there's maybe no surprises here, but obviously when you look at 90% of social science and humanities PIs had no technology transfer experience, whereas you could see in the physical sciences and also life sciences, those obviously they had more experience. No, when it comes to company formation, I suppose the interesting to see that there have been experience in terms of formation of startup companies, obviously more into physical and sciences and engineering, but it's also good to see in terms of the social sciences and humanities, which sometimes often maybe gets neglected in the focus on STEM, which naturally has happened. Obviously, in terms of licensing and patents, again, you can see maybe there's more predominance around the physical and life sciences. When it comes to in terms of stakeholders and the impact on stakeholders, again, I suppose it's interesting to see it's PIs would see that their impact is on the top three are in terms of other sort of academic partners, in terms of external institutions and universities, funders, and also in terms of academic partners from similar disciplines. You can see sort of breakdown in terms of top three from the sort of life sciences to the social sciences, but again, broadly similar. Obviously, maybe there's a slight difference in terms of rank order. When it comes to, well, how do we know that the impact that they're having? How do what do they see as the most effective indicators of impact? So you have obviously the scientific journals, so publishing in the top journals, and you can see that funding bodies and national governments are very quick to claim sort of national successes in terms of when national researchers are in the top tier in immunology or whatever the main areas, and you can see that in an Irish context. Interestingly, they also are very much focused in terms of the end user feedback engagement. So again, how is their scientific endeavor, how is that being used or consumed or enabled in terms of the end user and out in society, and also in terms of policy changes. So you can see, obviously, for social sciences, the policy changes is one of their top indicators. But again, I suppose it's very reflective, I suppose, in some senses, and I suppose maybe shatters maybe some of the myths that one would have, is that science for science sake, is that the PIs are very much interested in this more broader, wider societal and policy agenda as well as obviously their core activities, which is in terms of advancing science. When it comes to sort of supporting the role, 92% of them believe that the PI needs more dedicated support, really to look at in terms of managing some of those very maybe invisible tasks. Yes, PIs are celebrated when they get a funding in their institution. They get maybe a picture with their institutional president or vice chancellor, and it's a time for celebration. But also then the hard work begins. So again, I suppose support around the administration, budgeting, staff recruitment, all of that. But also PIs, I suppose, when we look at successful PIs, we look at their success, but it's a bit like the iceberg or the duck analogy, is that there are a lot of funding applications that weren't successful. So in some senses, they have to be very, very resilient. So again, I suppose, what are the most common critical setbacks experienced by PIs is obviously not getting funding, just getting teams together, and also in terms of challenges around communicating with external stakeholders, getting their voice heard with their critical stakeholders. So what does that mean, and when you stand back? For PIs, I suppose the messages are, obviously we have those sort of practical toolkits we've tried to develop as part of our activities in Cunningham to give sort of some tangible tools and approaches that PIs can take, and very much looking at it from a broad ecosystem sort of perspective. But what I would say to PIs, that are listening here this morning, is that being very proactive, looking at being a mentor, but also looking at mentorship not alone within the academic, but also drawing on mentors, wider than the academic community, is obviously in terms of collaboration and learning are critical parts of the role, and also continue to be open-minded in terms of those collaboration. Is, I suppose, be very reflective in terms of oneself, in terms of managing the resilience, not alone of an individual, but also the teams that may rely on you as a PI in terms of their own career and their career trajectory. Also, I suppose maybe we also need to talk maybe more in science, maybe more broadly, about how we cope with failure in science, because that is part of science discovery, and it's part of advancing all of that. And also, I suppose the PI role is one that is not alone scientific leadership, but it is a leadership of people, but also it's a leadership within a community, within your regional context, within a national and international context, around different, in terms of that boundary spanning thing, around sort of different actors. For universities, public research organisations, I suppose it's really to formally recognise that we need to prepare scientists, those maybe at the postdoc, even I would say go back to maybe masters or all of that level that are going, is that there better needs to be more formal, better preparation in terms of role development. So think that you're giving money based on scientific excellence, and you're assuming that they have all of these other capabilities, that they can manage the complexities and the visible and invisible roles. Also, I suppose, recognise in terms of workloads, all of that in terms of real tangible institutional supports for the PI role. So if PIs are getting, I remember one quote from one of the PIs that we interviewed a while back. You said, I spend 99% of my time on administration, 1% of my time on science. So then, so that is not a situation that we would want for scientists in the PI role. Is that they're dedicating, and there's more balance in terms of their endeavour and their activity. Also, it looks at in terms of how universities support in terms of their institutional architecture around the academic entrepreneurship agenda. So around the third mission, second mission, and how do they actually formally engage at the institutional level, break it down to faculty, department level around this university industry engagement and societal. And is this really valued when it comes to promotion, or is this a nice to have and rather than a must to have, and that we truly value it? And if we're saying that the region is important to university, then that has to be reflected in terms of how PIs and scientists are engaged. And the legitimacy of all of this activity within an academic institution is critically important. For funding agencies, I think the message from the research that we've done, and this is part of maybe the European Commission work as well, is that maybe when you're looking at funding evaluation, it's maybe some sort of recognition or in terms of the managerial skills, experience, career situation of PIs. But also in terms of designing of funding programs is, yes, there's a focus on the scientific one, but also, I suppose, looking at what the human capital development opportunities, EDI, gender issues are critically important. Looking at in terms of how funding agencies programs are interrelated and how they are funding agencies, different funding agency programs are related to each other in terms of how it supports the broader research system. And more importantly is in terms of the real sort of support that's needed for knowledge transfer and research commercialization, and that there are maybe more discretionary funding, that there's more autonomy, that there's more flexibility when it comes to the academic entrepreneurship angle, and also maybe more recognition around the public and societal value in terms of funding programs. For industry, my message is simply this, is to look at your relationships with universities, with individual research centres and academics in terms of as a strategic rather than a transactional relationship. So scientists have huge wealth of networks in terms of scientific communities. We've seen this in terms of the pandemic, in terms of mobilization of these international networks. But also is looking at in terms of building that longer term sort of relationship over a sustained number of years. And that can be multifaceted, to do with sort of research, it can be doing in terms of with students, it can be doing it in terms of the academic programs, in terms of teaching programs. But also is to be looking at in terms of leveraging sort of the existing public funding programs, because that opens up other industry collaborations, and all of the benefits that have been posited in the empirical studies so far all point to having relationships with universities enhances industry in terms of their R&D activity, in terms of what they get involved in, the access to scientific discoveries, sharing of the cost, sharing of some of the rewards and benefits. And lastly, I suppose our collective channel. So Van Heer Bush, in terms of, back in 1945, talked about in terms of, as part of the US Office for Scientific Research and Development, talk about the scientific focus and pioneers. And science, he argued, offers a largely unexplored hinterland for the pioneer who has the tools for his task. And I suppose collective challenge that we all have is to make sure that scientists in the PI role and those that are going to go into the PI role and the future generations have the tools that are necessary for the multiple visible and invisible tasks of the role, because they are both scientific, market, and also I would argue scientific shapers. And they're very critically important in terms of, not alone in terms of the scientific discovery, academic entrepreneurship, but also in terms of the regions that they inhabit. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it there, and I'm very much welcome any questions, and if anyone wants to come to me after the presentation, I'll be very happy to engage there. Okay, thanks very much, Lawrence.
James, thank you for that very thorough, if whistle stop tour through everything. My God, it's been a hell of a long journey, and thank you very much for some great insights. Before I take some questions from the audience, I'm just going to stop the recording, because that'll allow people to be a little bit more engaged, and we can have a bit of a conversation. But for the recording, if you're listening back, I'd like to thank again my colleague, Professor James Cunningham, for an excellent talk. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock, we will have Professor Nola Hewitt-Dundas, who will be talking further on industry-university engagement, and how we have different cultures and how we have to address those. So I hope that you'll join us. And then Ricardo Finney from Bologna will be coming in on Friday morning, talking about academic entrepreneurship and the work he's done with Horizon 2020 there, and looking at the impact of that on the ecosystem. So I'm just going to stop the recording now. Please God, if Teams did exactly what it was supposed to. And I thank everybody, and we'll take some questions. So we're just